Chapter 37. Jump. Jump, hurry. This was the only thing Mason's empty head could think of at the moment. His lips trembled, his legs went weak, and he ran down the stairs in a daze. As long as he left this house, he could return to the people outside. Mason supported his limp body, desperately running down the stairs. He didn't dare to turn around, but just ran like crazy, and soon reached the locked door. He intended to crawl out again. Who would have thought that after shaking the door twice, it wouldn't budge at all? Who saw that the lock on the door was loose, so they reinforced it, and wrapped another round of iron chain around it. Mason. Damn it. The cold air rushed in from behind. He couldn't help but turn his head, looking at that child with eyes wide open as if they were about to crack. No, he shouldn't be called a child, this was not a person at all. That wet ghost leisurely walked down the stairs. It raised its broken head that was still spitting blood. Mason could still smell the faint pungent smell. Those bright brown pupils stared at Mason. He shook the iron chain in horror. When he found that he couldn't move the door anymore, he almost fell to the ground paralyzed. Turning his eyes to see another room on the right, Mason gritted his teeth. Fortunately, the ghost's movement speed was very slow. It seemed like it was just slowly walking here step by step. Mason tumbled into the room, closed the door, and then slowly breathed a sigh of relief. Then he turned his head and realized that this room had no other way out. In other words, he was trapped here. Mason gasped, almost having a heart attack. Now that he had time to rest, he couldn't help but curse in his heart. Who the hell designed the structure of this house to be so strange? After that, he could only feel angry helplessly. This lock was an old design from who knows how many years ago. It was the kind that opened with a copper key. There was no automatic locking, so without the key, Mason couldn't even lock the door. He could only block the door and pray that the thing outside would leave quickly. Mason scanned the room once, and couldn't find anything that could be used. As a result, when he turned his head, his eyes happened to look through the small gap between the two doors. Outside the door was a silent eye with dilated pupils, staring coldly at him. Mason! Exclamation point. It hadn't left yet, but was outside the door looking at him. This time, Mason really couldn't breathe. He rolled his eyes and almost fainted, his legs trembling, a warm stream of water flowing down his legs. Now he didn't even have the strength to curse. He could only cling to the door, turn his head and accidentally see something behind him that he didn't recognize just now. It was like a wooden hatch cover. It was as if Mason was grabbing onto a life-saving straw, holding the door tightly while stretching out his legs to kick the wooden hatch open. Then, he was delighted to discover that there was actually a tunnel-like passage below. Mason took a breath, took a wooden stick from the side to block the door, quickly crawled down and turned around to close the hatch. There was a very large space underground. He carefully crouched down and crawled into a small, dark cave. Logically speaking, such a cave must have another exit. Mason had suffered enough outside. He had difficulty bending down to climb down the gap that was too small for a grown man. But he finally crawled down. Below seemed to be a giant man-made cave. The sound of dripping water echoed in the deserted space. Who knows how long there had been no traces of humans. On the cliffs grew damp green moss. In the middle of the cave there was a pond. The pond water was opaque yellow of sand and dust. On the other side of the pond, one could vaguely see light penetrating through. Mason breathed a sigh of relief, holding onto the rocks, carefully moving on the cold, damp, sticky cliff. He slowly walked towards the pond, intending to circle around the pond and climb up the stone wall in front. But he didn't know if it was because the ground was too slippery, or for some other reason. When he got close to the pond, he lost his footing, slipped and fell straight into the cold pond, but Mason wasn't too panicked because he knew how to swim. This calmness lasted until he noticed something wrapped around his waist. Mason turned around and saw a pale little face submerged in the water, along with a few streaks of blood. The child was submerged in the water, its bright eyes wide open looking at him without any emotion. Its two slender, pale white arms were tightly wrapped around his waist, pulling Mason down. Mason's eyes widened in horror, his heart in extreme panic. No, he didn't want to die yet. He still had a manor, the right to inherit the Verger family's property. He had. Mason hurriedly grabbed onto a rock protruding from the pond, the cold, slippery green moss sliding back and forth in his hands. Even though the rough stone rubbed and scratched his palm, Mason didn't dare to let go. While Mason was struggling desperately, he suddenly noticed a shadow looming in front of him. Someone was coming. He raised his head, delighted to see that the person in front of him was Siddle. In his panic, Mason didn't even have time to think about why a little girl would appear in this remote, locked underground cave. His voice trembled with cold, but he couldn't hide his joy. Siddle, hurry up. Pull me up quickly. Mason didn't know if a 12-year-old girl could pull him up, but at this moment, those two cold little hands were still tightly locked around his waist, pulling him down. So if Siddle ran out to call for help, it would obviously be too late. Mason could only place his hope on Siddle. He shouted these words, but found that the little girl in front of him didn't move at all. She stood in front of the pool, her fair face, her deep blue eyes like a frozen lake, without a ripple, looking down at him from above, calmly brushing the strands of blonde hair that fell on the side of her face behind her ears. The little girl's eyes were cold, her expression a little strange. She calmly glanced at the water behind him, then raised her foot and stepped down, coincidentally stepping on Mason's hand that was clinging to the rock. Mason was stunned, not having time to react, but he subconsciously felt that something was wrong. Immediately after, he saw a strange smile on the little girl's fair face. She flicked her wrist, then raised a crowbar with a sharp tip that flashed in the dark cave. Mason. Wait, where did she get the crowbar? Mason suddenly understood something. He started to struggle violently. In front of him was a little girl with a smile on her mouth but holding a deadly weapon in her hand. Behind her was an unknown creature that looked small but very strong. He couldn't escape. The crowbar flew down with a whistling sound of wind and a bang sound hit Mason's head. A stream of blood rose to the surface of the water. The man's strong body was floating in the pond but had not yet sunk to the bottom. Siddle walked around the old buildings of the orphanage. She went around but could not find Mason. She suddenly remembered the underground bunker built under the orphanage, hesitated for a moment but still decided to go there to take a look. Mason was half alive and half dead, floating on the surface of the pond. A few streaks of blood were still floating on the surface of the water. She was stepping on the man's hand, and she was still holding a crowbar in her hand. It was exactly like the scene of a serious murder, and she was caught in the act. Siddle. She didn't have time to withdraw her hand, only to hear someone calling from behind. Siddle. That person said. The voice sounded a bit familiar, and there was a sense of joy, like a normal greeting between neighbors. Siddle was stunned again. She turned her head and saw the man in the dark coat waving the flashlight from her to the handsome man in the pond. It was Hannibal. Oh, he chuckled softly, slowly walking forward. This is really. What a big surprise. His words showed intimacy, smiling and greeting Siddle. We meet again, little biscuit. Siddle. Why did it change from darling to little biscuit? She looked serious, her cold expression just now had not changed in time. After 5 years, meeting Hannibal again, Siddle said, Doctor, we are not close. So don't give her random nicknames, making her feel like she was a dish. The nickname, darling, is just my translation, but in Chinese it is. The word means sweet, so the N9 thinks of food. Hannibal, His eyes stopped on the crowbar in Siddle's hand, looking thoughtful. Siddle. You know, there will definitely be a misunderstanding. Although it doesn't seem to be a misunderstanding. Hannibal's eyes slowly moved towards Mason, who was living on the shore. Mason had passed out since Siddle hit him with a stick, and the figure of the child clinging to him was nowhere to be seen. I wonder if it has already sunk into the water. Hannibal looked at Siddle's posture, sighed silently, and reached out to pull the crowbar out of her hand. But he couldn't pull it out. Siddle held her precious weapon tightly, her big blue eyes glaring back at him fearlessly. She only changed her posture, silently lowering the crowbar from its stance of preparing to strike someone and gently hiding it behind her. Hannibal. He didn't care about the weapon issue, so he didn't pay much attention and let go. Do you remember the book I gave you? At Hannibal's unexpected question, Siddle hesitantly nodded. Actually, at first, she had always kept that book of nursery rhymes by her pillow, which contains several very interesting nursery rhymes. It was just that she put it in a corner afterwards, but didn't throw it away. What did he want to do? Whoever commits a crime becomes a slave to crime, don't follow the mold of the world. When he read that sentence in a low voice, his voice was as low as a cello, as if he was reciting poetry. Hannibal's eyes were calm, staring intently at Siddle and the crowbar behind her with a meaningful gaze. Siddle. Maybe she understood. The little girl quietly hid the crowbar a little more carefully, trying to explain, actually, I didn't mean to hurt him. Hannibal conveniently pulled Mason out of the water, turned him over, his eyes stopped at the faint blood stain on the back of the man's neck. The skull there was clearly dented. Siddle. She could only remain silent.